Interviews help us to gain insights from a person by listening to their story. We learn from them. We can use those learnings to improve or to change things. Interviews can be one-on-one. Often one-on-one interviews are best when we're trying to gather rich insights to understand the worldview of the person we're interviewing. If we want to learn from them really personal information or information that could be considered as controversial, then it's best to conduct one-on-one interviews in those particular situations. There are times when one to multiple interviews are really good to understand and are actually more beneficial than one-to-one interviews. And these are when the insights that we're trying to learn are of a less personal nature. Then sometimes we'll conduct focus groups. And these are particularly beneficial when we're trying to learn something about how a person uses a product or a service. And often in focus groups, one person's answer will trigger another person's memory, and they will either confirm the story or give a slightly different variation of that story. Having a group of 3 to 6 can quickly give us multiple insights and save us time. I don't recommend any more than 6 in an interview process with focus groups. I have seen it done before, but ideally I think 3 to 6 gives you some really good insights. So before we actually conduct an interview with, whether it's a single interview or whether it's a focus group, you kind of want to determine actually what you want to know. So you really want to have a purpose for the interview and an objective about what it is from them that you want to learn. And once you've done that, you want to work out, well, who's the best person to learn this information from and where are they located? And ideally you want to have multiple different perspectives. So you need to address, well, who could give us as much information as we can so that we can really get some insights happening. You also want to know how many interviews do I need to conduct? And sometimes you don't fully know the answer up front. You might only be able to answer the question of how many different perspectives or opinions do I need? And it's not until you're through the interview process when you start to go through that process, you determine whether you're starting to hear the same answer again, which is what we call convergence. And when we start to reach convergence, then it's typically time to stop. But if we're still getting so many different viewpoints, which is what we call divergence, then typically we want to continue on. So we might have to conduct at times more than we anticipated or possibly less. And this will depend on whether we're receiving convergent information or whether the information is converging. You also want to consider how long will the interview go for. I don't recommend anything longer than an hour, and I typically recommend 15 to 20-minute interviews. Keep them really simple. Remembering you're asking of another person their time, and time is valuable, so be really mindful of their time. Also consider, do I need to ask any permissions before conducting the interview? And if so, who do I need permission from? Before we embark on learning about people or a particular person, it's important to understand the key questions that we're going to ask of them. And typically, to do this, we will develop what we call an interview protocol. An interview protocol contains the questions that we're going to ask. And from my experience, every interview is different because we don't know what the person is going to say or where the interview is going to take us. So having a guideline by using an interview protocol will ensure that we're asking the key questions that we want to know, and it gives us a guide so that the interview doesn't go off track to a place that gets us away from what it is that we're trying to understand. And that can happen if we don't rein it in at times. So having an interview protocol gives us a framework of the key questions that guide us into gaining insights from that person. When we have a question sequence, we want to decide how we're going to begin. When we develop the interview protocol, we will typically begin with rapport building questions. So they're those, getting to know you kind of open questions that we all do when we meet somebody for the first time. You want to keep the interview questions open-ended and broad, and very broad, particularly at the beginning of the interview. An example of a broad question might be something like, what is your role here, if we're in a work situation? And after the broad question, you want to start narrowing the questions down so you can learn more from them to gain some better insights. So some examples of this some follow-up questions from what is your role here might be things like, tell me more about your role, like who do you help? You might then further ask, how do you help them? And then your next question might be something like, well, tell me about the process that you go through to help them. And then you might ask them something like, do you face any challenges when trying to help them? And you might then further drill down and tell me about those challenges that you face. And then you might say, well, can you tell me about the hardest challenge that you've ever faced? And then you might continue something along the lines of, and how did you solve that problem? And these kinds of laddering, what we call laddering questions, where we start to drill down. Typically when you finish your interview, you want to, and this will be in your interview protocol, you want to ask another open-ended question that signals to the interviewee that the interview is about to conclude. An example of that might be, well, before we finish, is there anything further that you would like to add? And this question signals to the interviewee that the interview is about to end, and it gives them an opportunity to add any information that they felt that we may not have covered, or questions that we might not have asked, so that they can further contribute with their viewpoint and their perspective. And then when you've finished, thank them for their time and their effort and their energy in coming to the interview, or whether you were doing the interview online, and ask them if they would like to receive the results of the actual research. Not everybody does this, but I always think it's some people are really interested, and depending on who you're interviewing and what the process is, sometimes it might be good to ask them, did they want to see a transcript of the interview, so that they can clarify that they're happy with what was said, and be sure that they want to contribute that information. And it's kind of an ethical thing to do, but I understand that not everybody does this. Now I want to talk to you about the silent pause. If you're new to interviewing techniques, and if you're new to empathy interviewing as well, it's a really good art to practice. And if you're a salesperson, it's also a really good art to practice. Too often, we find ourselves, when somebody's giving us an answer or telling us about their problem, is that we'll jump in to start solving that for them, and we'll start interjecting. And sometimes people feel uncomfortable when there is a silent pause, but sometimes it's because the person actually needs room inside their own head to construct their answer. And They need to do this before they speak. Now, this doesn't happen with everybody, but it does happen with some people in particular. And so what we need to do is give them the time that they need to construct their answer. Give them some time in their own head to work out what it is that they want to say. And this is when we have to develop the art of the silent pause, and that involves us stop talking. Just give them the time, give them the space, practice the silent pause. Now, if you're struggling with this, a really good little tip that I learned a long time ago is to just do 4 breaths and give yourself 4 breaths, really deep belly breaths, and that gives you something to do while the silent pause is occurring, so that you don't jump in and interject, and it gives the person some space inside their own head so that they can construct their own answer. Another thing is, when you do interviewing, is try and keep as many, if not all, of your questions open. Be really, really careful about constructing closed-ended questions, because these can introduce bias. You want the person to answer from their perspective, and open questions allow us to learn new things, because after all, we're trying to gain insights. We're trying to learn about their thoughts, their feelings, and their actions so that we can understand them better. And open-ended questions help us to do that. So use terms like how do you do that, or why do you do that, and keep those questions open. Gaining insights is about learning something new, something that we didn't know before. Be curious. Learn from the person you're interviewing, and good luck with your interviewing techniques.